The following is a conversation between Lindsay Levin, founder and managing director of Leaders Quest, and Denver Frederick, host of The Business of Giving, on AM 970 The Answer in New York City.
If you go on the internet and look for courses in leadership, you will not be disappointed. There are plenty to choose from, whether you want to do it online or in person. But you won't see too many reviews from those who have taken them who will refer to their course as having been life-changing or transformative, the way you will for Leaders Quest. And it's a great pleasure for me to have with us this evening the founder and managing director of Leaders Quest, Lindsay Levin. Good evening, Lindsay, and welcome to the Business of Giving.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So tell us about Leaders Quest, which you found back in 2001, its purpose, and what makes it so exceptional.
Thank you. Sure. So Leaders Quest is really about bridging divides. Our work is about connecting people from very different walks of life, from very different industries, from different sectors, from different countries, and having people learn from one another.
Well, I want to go on a quest, okay? So who am I going to go with? Where across the world are you going to take me? How long is it going to be? And what am I going to do when I'm there?
Sure. We do, broadly speaking, two kinds of quests. And the first, the sort of program you might join us for, would typically be 1 week long. Mm-hmm. It could take place anywhere. It could be here in the US, it could be in the Middle East, it could be somewhere in Africa, somewhere in Asia, somewhere in Latin America. For example, our next program is in Kenya. Program after that is in Cuba. The one after that is in Israel and Palestine and the West Bank. And so you would typically spend a week with us. You would be with a real mixed group of leaders from different walks of life. So people from big corporations, also entrepreneurs, also social entrepreneurs, people leading nonprofits, very deliberate mix, and also people from different countries. And in the course of 5 or 6 days with us, you would go out and visit with all kinds of leaders and all kinds of organizations in whichever country we're visiting. We would deliberately mix up time with businesses, with innovators, with entrepreneurs, with scientists and technologists, with also visits to communities where we spend time in grassroots communities, slums, townships, villages, where people are driving change from the bottom up.
So I do this and I'm observing and listening and watching other people make change. How is that going to help transform me?
Well, you know, one of the ways I think about our work is that you can feel like you're looking through a window, you're looking out at something else, and you discover that it's not really a window, it's actually a mirror. So what goes on is that in the course of having these different visits, different kinds of conversations, it's very mutual. You're learning, you're sharing, you're asking questions, you're pursuing the things that really interest you. And in the course of that, what typically happens for people is you start to think about your own life and you start to think about your own way of leading, your own way of relating to people, and you start to notice different things about how you do what you do.
You know, it sounds, Lindsay, a little bit like another organization I'm familiar with called Roots of Empathy.
Right.
And it teaches children empathy, and it does so by bringing a baby, less than one, into the classroom on a blanket with its mother, and you observe what the baby is trying to do, trying to sit up, the frustrations of reaching a rattle, looking for his mother, and the kids begin to talk among themselves. And what it does in terms of changing their behavior as it relates to bullying, inclusiveness, being kind, it does kind of create, and it sort of sounds similar to what in watching somebody else trying to make change, you reflect back inward on yourself, correct?
Right, exactly. And, you know, one of the reasons I started this was that I believe that we don't spend enough time engaging with different people and knowing people who we might think of as being other than us. So, you know, in my view and in my experience, once you've met people from a different country or from a different part of your own town, a different neighborhood, once you've actually talked to them about the things that matter to them, it's impossible to go back to seeing them as other.
Yeah.
You form a connection that changes the way that you look at relationships and that you look at life.
And another thing that I think is distinctive, and you just touched on it a little bit, is this sense of self-awareness, because I think we spend so much of our time almost exclusively looking at our external environment and trying to win and get profits.
Right.
But you really can't be a great leader unless you are self-aware, correct?
I agree. I mean, self-awareness, the ability to cooperate and collaborate. You know, the world on the one hand is very competitive, but it also needs partnership. It also needs collaboration. And I think today we need that far, far more than we ever did in the past.
Well, you started this 15 years ago, as I mentioned, back in 2001. Yeah. And since you began, what we look for and what we need in the leader has certainly changed dramatically. What are some of the big differences you have observed, and how is that reflected in the way you design and develop Leaders Quest?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things is that the world is changing very fast, and that's not going to slow down. So Be it technology, be it scale, be it the numbers of people on the planet, be it how we're all mixed up together, the world is changing very fast. And so one of the challenges for leaders is to actually be at peace with that, to be able to work with fast change, to cope with ambiguity, to cope with uncertainty. And I think for that, you need to be very, very rooted in what you stand for. Understand your own values, understand what's important to you, have a sense of optimism, see possibility, work with hope. And so those are some of the things that we try to show people, is that the world isn't just the newspaper headlines that you read or, watch on the internet. The world is full of people trying to do great things every day. And if you connect in with that, and if you build relationships with those kinds of people, you deliver very different outcomes.
Yeah. You work with a lot of business leaders, and I think that there's been a lot said and talked about in terms of businesses need to be more than profits. They need to embed all these different social values into their work. And that, I think, is pretty quite advanced in many cases. I guess the question I have is, how widespread is it? Are we still looking at a few exemplary companies that are doing this, trying to attract the best talent and have these values not over in a CSR office, but in everything they do? Or is it really becoming widespread in all kinds of businesses and all across the world?
I think we're still at an early stage on that journey. I think it's a very important transition. I think it takes years, not months or weeks. And in that sense, I think we're at an early stage. But I do think that if anything, there's a real speeding up right now of people realizing that there's some things wrong with the way we do things. Our economic system actually needs to change. Businesses' role in the world, whether we like it or not, is changing. And so what a lot of company leaders are doing, and we spend a lot of time with people working on this, is figuring out how to respond to that. How do you put purpose in the core of your business? Not as something that you do on Sundays, that something that you do as a CSR project, but how do you make whatever it is you do, the products you create, the services that you provide, how do you make sure that you're doing that with a sense of social purpose as well as for financial return? And I also think that in up-and-coming generation, people deeply care about being part of something purposeful. I mean, I think everybody does. We all want to do something meaningful with our lives. And it can get a little buried in the hurry and the mad dash and the pressures of day-to-day life. But in my experience, as soon as you kind of dig a little bit, you find people who really want to do something meaningful and who will give their all if given the opportunity to do that.
You are the author of an exceptionally well-received book entitled Invisible Giants, Changing the World One Step at a Time. Let's start with, what is an invisible giant?
Well, Invisible Giants was my way of talking about the fact that there are many, many, many millions of people doing great things in the world. And when we think about leaders that we admire, we usually, each of us, come up with a very short list of the most wonderful, famous characters that have, populated our past. But in my experience, every day you can go out and find people in a corner store, in a small business here or a small business there, out in a community. You find people doing good work. And many of them actually end up delivering change on real scale, but typically unsung heroes. So I wanted to celebrate the idea that people who are sometimes less visible, especially, by the way, in far-flung corners of the world, different parts of Africa and Asia, or towns in somewhere in the middle of America, are doing really good work and are giants in their own field and have a great deal to share and for others to learn from.
Well, that is inspiring, because I think we sometimes get so overwhelmed with the barrage of bad news that we are constantly fed. I mean, there's some troubled places and things in the world, but I think the media doesn't help, that you can very easily have a sense of helplessness and say to yourself, well, what difference can I make? So give us an example to give us hope and inspire us of one of these invisible giants.
I mean, there's lots of examples, but let me pick on a man called Naidu, an Indian gentleman who I met early on in my work. I met him in the city of Bangalore. And he is working with, or was working at the time, with mentally disabled people. So people with all kinds of mental problems from very, very poor communities. No access to medication, no access to doctors typically. And he created an amazing network of kind of barefoot doctors, so local people who trained with some basic training to take care in different ways of people with mental disabilities. Not the same as having full medical care, obviously, but an extraordinary network that spread throughout India. And, the first time I met Naidu, I just remember walking into a room and this wonderful man, he himself is physically disabled. His smile lit up and he was just a man of such goodness, really shone out. So I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot from watching the incredible tenderness and compassion and joy with which he engages with people. So he was one of many,
That's
many
a great
people
example.
that have
And we don't
influenced
pay
me.
enough attention to mental illness in this part of the world.
Right,
I can imagine in that part of the world it's never addressed or really discussed.
No, I mean, very tough. People in villages where the families don't know what to do, and they end up literally chaining people up. So it's really terrible. So a great deal to be learned from those kinds of examples.
Well, you have a lot of interesting observations in your book, but one that I thought was particularly interesting was a quote by Lin, and she said this: "India is like an injured person lying on the floor. All the wounds are visible and open to the air, and blood is flowing into the ground. But here in China, all our wounds are on the inside." Now, you had spent, Lindsay, an awful lot of time in both of those countries. What was Lin saying there?
Yeah, Lin is a Chinese colleague who I've worked with around the world, including in China, but also in India. And she was so struck when she went by what everybody's struck by in India, which is that it's very vibrant, very colorful, very expressive. The problems of the country you can see absolutely from the moment you set foot off the plane. It's chaotic. And it's wonderful as well.
Yeah.
It's got tremendous charm, but huge challenges, and they're really in your face. You can witness all of that, and people talk. It's a very vibrant democracy. People are talking about, sharing their ideas all the time. China feels more closed. It's harder for foreigners to understand. In my experience, though, it really warrants building relationships. As you get to know people there, they do open up. They've got a wonderful sense of humor. They care deeply about the same things that we care about. But it's had a really tough history. It's still got, a pretty closed political system in many ways. And Lin was really talking about that.
Yeah, they're very guarded, wound very tight.
Exactly. And she was really talking about that. I guess one of my reflections for those of us who spend time visiting China or wish to visit China is actually take the time and trouble to get to know people, because as with everyone, under the surface, we do all care about the same things as human beings.
You also were blown away about the amount of building that was going on and the number of people who were moving.
Right. I mean, China is in the middle of an incredible transition. It's the biggest ever migration from rural life to urban life. Very, very ambitious, difficult. There's many downsides to it, and there's some upsides too. The scale of change is incredible. And one of the things that it certainly has made me think, just looking at thousands and thousands and thousands of buildings under construction, is frankly the price on the earth. We have so many of us on this planet today, and how we successfully live together and plan together and grow together is deeply challenging. And by the way, the Chinese know that. I mean, they are smart people, very thoughtful about the problems that they're having to navigate.
The people you run into, so many of them are in difficult situations, and their lives are so hard, and they have so little money and so few possessions, that those must really be miserable lives, or so we assume.
Right.
But your travels, from what you've observed, that ain't necessarily the case, is it?
No, I mean, I think we often, look in on a situation and make assumptions, and in my experience, the assumptions are usually wrong. So, I might presume that the solution to problem A is to do one thing, and I'm usually wrong in that assumption. So it's really very much about asking people themselves. People in all kinds of what we might perceive to be poor communities. I spend a lot of time in slums in different parts of Africa, in different parts of India. Yeah, life is tough. Resources are short. Getting education for your kids is tough. Access to any kind of healthcare is tough. Access to clean water is tough. But people still have a tremendous sense of community, tremendous sense of personal agency. Some of the most impressive change makers are living in those kinds of tough circumstances. And certainly, I think there's a great deal that can be learned, for example, here in the West, about work that's going on in the east of the planet or, down in the south of the planet, and vice versa.
Yeah, they're underestimated. I think somebody was on the show once and said, try living on $1.25 a day, and you find out how innovative you become.
Right. I mean, the entrepreneurship and innovation in slum communities is really extraordinary. And in fact, one of the things that we do with some of the business leaders that we work with is help them to learn from that kind of innovation at the bottom of the pyramid. Because, the products and services that will serve the poorest 3-4 billion people on the planet are full of ingenuity. And in fact, that, in my view, is much of where the most exciting, interesting markets and opportunity to contribute and to grow businesses is going to come from.
Yeah, and I think you even see in this country, we're beginning to finally get a trickle of reverse innovation.
Right.
Companies like GE and others are taking these things and bringing them back here, and we never would have done that 10, 20 years ago.
Well, I want to give a plug to Detroit, actually, as
I was
you
going to ask you
raised
about
GE,
that.
because we're just in the middle of creating our first Quest in Detroit. And we're going to be bringing business leaders from around the world to visit Detroit and learn from what's happening there. And some part of it is the large companies, like the auto companies, really driving change and a real renaissance that's going on there. And at the same time, there's tremendous stuff happening in communities at a grassroots level. So I'm very excited by what Detroit has to share with the rest of the world, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the time I've spent there.
I know you did. You noted before that the world is changing at an accelerated rate, and I think a lot of other people have noted that as well. But you have introduced this idea that compassion needs to change at the same accelerated rate. You refer to it as Compassion X. What is Compassion X?
Well, Compassion X is really the idea that we are doing a lot of smart things on this planet. You know, we've got tremendous technology. We can do all kinds of things that were unimaginable 10, 15, 20 years ago. And at the same time, we're discovering more and more about the Earth and indeed about the universe. So there is a fantastic rate of change driven by human cleverness, if you like, human smartness. But at the same time, we actually need to be wise. We need to invest in being thoughtful. We need to invest in how we relate to one another, how we grow as human beings, what I would call wisdom. So we need to spend time on wisdom. And I think of compassion as being the bridge between this smartness and the wisdom. So compassion is really the ability to look at another person and to imagine myself in your shoes, to recognize that we are all part of the same whole and that actually ultimately my well-being is completely tied up with your well-being and the well-being of future generations.
You know, with Compassion X, there are 3 steps. You talk about the work we need to do on the inside, and that's a lifetime journey. And the third step is connecting the dots and bringing it all together. But let me focus on the second one, which is meeting in the middle, because to tell you the truth, Lindsay, that seems to be the one that we're having so much trouble with right now. And I know you don't need to agree with someone, but you need to at least listen and respect their point of view and be respectful about it. And boy, that's not going on, particularly in this political season.
Right.
How do you suggest, what insights can you provide there?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. The challenge of not being driven to the easy game of going to the extreme and being polarized and demonizing one another and assuming that somebody is your enemy because you don't agree with them. There's far too much of that going on. And my own belief, I deeply believe in the goodness of people. The majority, by far the majority of us, want to lead a decent life, want to be good to our neighbors, you know, care about the future, care about the next generation and so on. But it all gets lost in the intensity of life. So the meeting in the middle, for me, is about those of us who can really showing an example of that. It's about the ability to listen. It's about the ability to imagine yourself in somebody else's shoes. One of the reasons, you know, when I started Leaders Quest, the idea was if we go and meet each other, we're changed by that experience. You know, one of the things that you can do is get out and meet your neighbors. But go and connect with people on the other side of town. Yesterday, I spent time out in Brownsville, in Brooklyn, meeting with some fantastic projects that people are running there. And, you know, this is just a few stops on the subway and a different part of New York where there are great things going on.
Yeah, and you were also with the chair of the International Steering Committee of One Voice, where you were trying to get that meeting in the middle between some people on the Israeli and the Palestinian side. How did that experience come to go down?
You know, people are sometimes offended when I say this, but for me, it's no different to the differences between all kinds of other people. So it's driven by fear. It's driven by history. It's driven by, you know, good people who care about their own communities and families and have a certain narrative, but have ended up really pushed apart. So the work behind One Voice was to say, we want to engage with the majority of Palestinian people who actually want to live decently side by side with their neighbors, and we want to engage with the majority of Israeli people who also want to live decently side by side with their neighbors. For that, you have to believe in people. You have to be willing to spend time together. And my experience was of finding lots of fantastic people on both sides of that divide. And if anything, you know, one of the abiding memories is of the deep emotion and passion and care. People are very sad that their populations are in this much pain. So I learned a lot from that experience, and a lot that I've brought back into work with other kinds of communities around the world.
Yeah, and I think you provided some wonderful insight, too, about all the positive things that are happening in that part of the world, of which we never hear anything about.
Right. I mean, as with most things, we don't hear enough about the good stuff, and I think it pushes us into a worse and worse negative spiral.
Tell us a little bit about your website and where people would go to find it, and what will they find when they go there?
Right. Well, so we're at www.leadersquest, that's LEADERSQUEST.org, so .org. You'll find lots of stories, you'll find blogs, you'll find case studies, you'll find testimonials. We do a wide range of work. You'll be able to navigate through that, lots of images, and I very much hope to meet some of you there.
Well, some pretty inspiring stuff on it, I will testify to. Well, Lindsay Levin, Managing Director and founder of Leaders Quest, thanks so much for being on the show this evening. The book, again, is Invisible Giants, Changing the World One Step at a Time, and it reads very much like a fiction book. It is very descriptive writing, and it is very enjoyable to read, not dry at all. It was a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. I've been thrilled to be here.
The Business of Giving can be heard every Sunday evening between 6 and 7 p.m. Eastern on AM 970 The Answer in New York and on iHeartRadio. You can follow us at Biz of Give on Twitter and at Facebook.com/business.